Hi everyone. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about what I'm generally calling environmental health hazards. So environmental health hazards is going to include quite a lot of things. So far throughout the course, we have been talking about a whole host of different types of pollutants. And we have listed all the different places that those pollutants can come from and the different systems that they impact. So we have started off with talking about air and air pollution and carbon emissions and climate change. Then we shifted gears into discussing water and water pollution. And then we also talked about solid waste, so pollution on land, right? And in all of these cases, we always talked about sort of the environmental impact, right? So we know that there's not just an impact on our environment itself, but there's also a human health impact to all of these pollutants. So this particular lecture is going to focus on that. We're going to talk about and categorize these environmental health hazards. We're going to talk about how these toxicants move through the environment in very particular ways. So we're going to talk about some of these different toxicants and how they move. And then we're going to also discuss how we determine the health effects of pollutants. So how do we know how much we can be exposed to of these certain types of chemicals before we see adverse impacts on our health, before we start to see impacts. So let's start with in general, what we're talking about when we're talking about these environmental health hazards. We can talk about the toxicants themselves, and the toxicants are any type of chemical, and the chemical can be in any form. It can be solid, it can be liquid, it can be gas, and it has some type of adverse effect on health. So we refer to all of those things as being toxicants in our environment. Now, to be honest with you, any chemical can be toxic if your exposure to it is high enough. So even salt could potentially kill you if you ingested enough salt, right? So to some extent, any and all chemicals could potentially be toxicants. But what we're most concerned about are those that are in the environment that they're, again, typically in small doses that we are being subjected to. And depending on how much of those that we continue to breathe in or drink in through the water or get through other types of sources, those are the things that we're particularly concerned about. And there's a whole branch of study called toxicology. What toxicologists do is they actually study how toxicants impact living organisms. And it's not just humans we're concerned with, of course. We're concerned with the health of all kinds of living things. And toxicology is trying to determine how and why things are toxic, right? So how do we see these toxic accumulations of these chemicals? So how are things coming into contact with them? And are there ways that we can minimize or prevent the adverse effects that we're seeing of these? So that's a little bit different than something called epidemiology. So again, toxicology is separate from epidemiology. So epidemiology is now looking at how toxicants, those chemicals, but also biological agents such as diseases and even physical agents like radiation or nuclear accidents or things like that, how they impact populations. So rather than just being concerned with the chemical itself and what the impact of the chemical is, that's toxicology. In epidemiology, now what we're concerned about is we're concerned about how populations are being impacted by all of these things. So epidemiologists study big groups of people, and they investigate a range of causes and types of disease and injuries. So there's two types of exposure. Typically, when we're studying adverse impacts, we can talk about acute toxicity or something that's chronic. So acute is when you have bad things happen after a very single exposure, right? So this is immediate. So you would breathe in vapors from something, and if those vapors are noxious, we use the word noxious to describe something that's going to make you sick, that would be an acutely toxic substance, whatever you're in contact with. Because if you're exposed to it one time, you immediately have an impact. You are dizzy, you are nauseous. In some cases, you can even come into contact something with which could cause death with a single exposure. So those are acutely toxic substances. there aren't a lot of those. I mean, there are, don't get me wrong. However, these are things that typically we know about and we know are very highly regulated, these acute substances. What we know less about are chronic substances. So these substances that you're exposed to a toxicant for a very long period of time, but typically in a very small dose. So it could be air pollutants, for example. If you happen to live, for example, in, let's say, Los Angeles, let's take a place where we know that they have problems with air pollution. So it's kind of a hot spot here in the United States, if you will. If you live in the metro Los Angeles area and you are constantly exposed to that ground level ozone and some of those other types of pollutants that are very prevalent there, what's the long-term risk to you? Are you going to have lung disease issues? Are you at a higher risk for certain types of cancer? So those are sort of the prolonged effects that we would look at. So let's kind of shift gears here a little bit and let's talk about some of these biologics in the environment, these disease-causing organisms. So they're typically referred to in general as pathogens. These pathogens can come from a variety of different specific types of microorganisms, and we say microorganisms because it simply means that they're too small to be seen with the naked eye, so you would need a microscope to be able to see these. On the smallest end, you have viral particles. Please note that viruses technically don't meet the definition for being alive because they cannot self-replicate. That's what a virus does. It infects you so that your body then will make copies of the virus. So we refer to them as particles because, again, they're technically not alive. Bacteria and then also protozoa. So protozoa are a group of protists, which are mostly single-celled organisms that have a few things in common, but it's a widely varied group. So we can come into contact with these things from a variety of different ways. So some of these are transmissible in the environment, so you could get them from drinking contaminated water. You can get them from your food. You could get them from breathing them in the air, airborne pathogens. There are others, however, that are non-transmissible in the environment, which means that you have to have contact with someone who has that pathogen. So AIDS is exchanged by body fluids. You have to come in contact with the body fluids of someone who has AIDS in order to come in contact with the HIV virus, which causes AIDS. One of the biggest places where we see pathogens, especially when it comes to places that lack clean water, is sewage contaminated water. So we kind of talked about this a little bit in our water discussion, but this is one of the sort of greatest threats to public health globally, is the fact that many places do not have a separate system to deal with sewage, and that so what happens is your sewage is also mixed with your drinking water. So what you have is you have high incidence of a whole host of different types of bacteria and protists, and that's why, again, it's such a big threat to public health, is not having sanitary systems in place to deal with our sewage contaminated water. So this is a list of different types of diseases that are directly related to polluted water. So again, some of these are things that we don't really talk about here in the United States anymore because, once again, we have very distinct laws that help us to create a system to deal with our sewage, but that's not the case in a lot of developing countries. So you still have a lot of cases of things like cholera and dysentery and typhoid fever and a whole host of other things that come just from drinking the water. So this is the type of test that you would use if you were trying to figure out what we call colonies of coliform bacteria. So you can take drinking water and you can put it on a nutrient plate and you can incubate it for a few days, and when you take it out, you would, all of these little circles that you see here on these plates correspond with the number of bacterial colonies. So the more number of colonies you have in your water, the riskier it is to be drinking that water. So one thing that we do know is that when it comes to different types of diseases, and as something has been painfully obvious to us over the last 6 months, is that when humans come in contact with nature, and whether that is because we're building new roads through a rainforest, or whether it's because we're taking wild animals and we are selling them in a meat market, whatever it happens to be, these environmental changes where humans are coming into contact with parts of the environment that we have not yet been in contact with before, we see an awful lot of emerging diseases that happen in this case. And the current coronavirus pandemic is not the only time we have seen this. It has happened before. It's just that this is one of the few times in recent memory that we can remember having such a novel virus that is so unpredictable that it is causing so many problems globally, and it is directly related to the changes that we're seeing in these natural environments. So about 25% of injury and disease is related to human-caused environmental changes. So again, what does that mean? It's a whole host of things. It could mean, again, coming in contact with contaminated drinking water. Some of these things are a lot more complex. So again, if you cut down forests and build dams and you are in an area where you're coming into contact with wild animals, all of these wild animals have their own sets of pathogens. When humans are not part of that system, the pathogens stay in their host species, right? They don't jump. But when humans increasingly come into contact with more and more natural sort of intact areas, you have more opportunity for those pathogens to become what we call transgenic. Transgenic just means that they are no longer just infecting the original source host, whatever it happens to be, whether it's a snake or a bat or an armadillo or whatever it happens to be. Now it has been able to transmutate, and it is now possible of infecting humans as well. So it's one of the big reasons why what we're doing to the environment and some of the impacts. So we talked about with biodiversity, we talked about habitat loss being one of the biggest threats to biodiversity. At the same time, we are also increasing our risk of coming into contact with these novel pathogens. And remember, what makes them so dangerous is that our systems as humans, we've never seen these things before. So we don't have any built-in systems to recognize them and fight them right away. What also makes it very difficult to fight once these diseases do emerge, once again, as we saw with the new coronavirus, is populations don't stay still anymore, right? We live in an age of global travel. So as soon as the outbreak began in Wuhan, China, even before it was recognized as an outbreak, there were people who were traveling all over the world from Wuhan, right? And people who were going to Wuhan, into the impact zone. So what we saw is even before we could recognize that we had a problem, that we even knew that this virus was responsible for making people sick, we already had people who had that pathogen and were already spreading it. So it makes it extremely difficult to stay on top of and get on top of some of these diseases. One example of something that we continue to fight, and it's been around for a very long time, is malaria. So malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes, and there are 60 different species of mosquitoes that transmit the parasite that causes malaria. Malaria is a huge problem in different parts of Southeast Asia, different parts of Northern Africa. There's a whole host of areas that have problems with malaria simply because that's where the mosquitoes that transmit these diseases, that's where they live. Malaria has been around. We know the only way to stop transmission of disease is to kill the mosquitoes themselves. And so there's a lot of sort of different types of insecticides and things that we try to use in order to prevent mosquitoes coming into contact with people, because that's the way we can stop the spread. Unfortunately, as climate is changing and as places are becoming warmer and more humid, these same mosquitoes that transmit malaria are able to expand their habitat. And as they're expanding their habitat, we're bringing malaria into places that typically we didn't see it before. This is true of lots of mosquito-borne diseases. It's not just malaria, but if you remember a few years ago, we were talking about the Zika virus. And the Zika virus was specifically dangerous to pregnant women. And the Zika virus was in the South. It's still there. It hasn't gone away, by the way. The Zika virus is still there. We just obviously have other things to talk about right now. But it was specifically prevalent in the southeastern United States because, once again, the mosquito that carried Zika had moved its way up into the southeastern part of the United States because of temperature and humidity. And so we expect to see those things continue. We will probably see more of these mosquito-borne viruses expanding into different parts of the United States, once again, simply because we're allowing optimal conditions for these mosquitoes to exist. And then, of course, the other problem with any type of disease and any spread of any disease happens just to be the number of people we have in urban areas, so urban crowding. So the closer in contact we are with each other, the more likely it is that we're going to spread germs with each other, which is why we're so much in favor of trying to enforce very strict social distancing measurements and things like wearing masks. We're trying to create a culture of these behaviors which will now allow us to get on top of this pandemic rather than always being 2 steps behind it. So at this point, we're pretty much all familiar with what a pandemic is. Anytime a disease reaches nearly all the parts of the world, we consider it a pandemic. This is not the only pandemic we've ever had. There have been previous pandemics. We had avian influenza, which again didn't impact us here in the United States as much. It had a much larger impact in a lot of Asian countries. That was a pandemic. So again, the nice thing, if you will, not that there's a nice thing about a pandemic, but on the bright side of avian influenza, once it's not easy to transmit to humans. So it's something that really is staying within birds. It's a bird flu. That's why we refer to it as that. It transmits very easily into the birds, but it doesn't really impact humans as much. But on the downside of that, the mortality rate is about 3 to 4 times higher than what we're seeing with the coronavirus right now. The swine flu was the next one. So this was about 11 years ago. So this was late spring in 2009. Started in Mexico. We had an instance of a flu virus that jumped from a bird to a pig to a human. So that's actually a fairly common way for things to move. Pigs are a good intermediary between human viruses and avian viruses. So they typically can be infected by both. And once you had a sort of a novel combination of a brand new bird flu and a new human virus, the two sort of came together in these pigs, and then humans were impacted by that. So in late spring, it was identified as originating in Mexico, and by early summer, it had sort of reached globally. And that was one for which, again, not nearly the same impact as we're seeing with the new coronavirus, but it was something that was dangerous, and it was something that certainly we didn't have to go through the same precautions and measures that we're going through this time. But we did reinforce a lot of behaviors such as washing hands and staying home if you felt sick and those types of things. And then, of course, our current coronavirus situation right now. It's really tough to get on top of pandemics for a couple of different reasons. And first of all, you have to understand the environment and the conditions that allow the virus to survive and travel. This is something that the scientific community is continuing to debate right now. We've known about the virus for 6 months now, and we are still not 100% in agreement with how it survives and how it travels. So there's a lot of debate going back and forth between, how is it is airborne, but how much of a risk is airborne contamination, and our surface is still at play. And it's something that, again, we're just trying to get on top of as quickly as we can, but it's very difficult. The other part about this is cooperation among governments and individuals. And this is definitely a part where the United States has fallen far behind other countries. We don't have any sort of federal coordinated effort when it comes to cooperating and coming out with federal guidelines on what to do about the virus. It has largely been left up to the states to decide themselves. And we have seen a lot of different approaches between different states. And unfortunately, what we're doing isn't working. And so whether or not we're going to see at some point a federal response that gives more clear guidelines to everyone remains to be seen. But right now we know that this patchwork approach has not resulted in the successes that other countries have had. So again, this is just sort of an idea here that pigs, again, are a really good intermediary for flu viruses that get passed on to humans, simply because they can be infected both by bird flu viruses and also human flu viruses. And so those two viruses can mutate and mix and create something novel and new that can then be passed on to humans. All right, so moving on to how toxicants move around in the environment. So let's go back to those toxicants, those chemicals that we talked about before. And the ones that we're most concerned about are things that travel quickly in the environment and they hang around for a long time. DDT is a great example of this. DDT was a widely used pesticide. It was used a lot in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, came out right after World War II. 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was seen as kind of a miracle because you could kill, it was broad spectrum, you could kill all kinds of insects with it, and it worked very well, and it was very cheap. Unfortunately, what we didn't know is that it was dangerous. What was happening was DDT was accumulating in tissue, in living tissue of living things, and as higher up the food chain you went, you found direct consequences of this bioaccumulation. So bioaccumulation is when your body can't metabolize a toxicant, it can't break it down. You don't just get rid of it with your waste. So what happens instead is you store it in your tissues. So when you bioaccumulate some of these toxicants, it could over time produce some sort of consequence. And in the case of birds, what was happening is fish-eating birds, so birds that were fairly high up on the food chain, were ingesting lots and lots of DDT because everything that they ate had already come into contact with DDT. And so we have a new impact called biological magnification. So what happens is things at the bottom of the food chain ingest just a little bit of the toxicant, but as you move up the food chain, you're eating more and more and more, and so that impact becomes magnified. So what happened to these birds is you would have them not reproducing anymore. They weren't having babies because the calcium that they're supposed to be putting in their eggs to make those shells nice and hard was being blocked by the DDT. So what would happen is the adults would sit on the eggs and the eggs would break. So you had a huge decline in the population of these birds, and it wasn't until DDT was banned that we actually saw reproductive success rates go back up. So again, this is just kind of an idea of bioaccumulation and biological magnification, how it works. Again, there might be only a little bit of DDT in the water, but as you move up the food chain, you begin to accumulate more and more and more of it just because of the sheer amount of food that you're eating that contains DDT. So toxicants can go anywhere. They can move through the air, the soil, the water. Again, at high concentrations, we know it can be deadly. At low concentrations, we particularly might have chronic health problems related to this. So this is sort of a nice way to look at what happens to pesticides after they're sprayed and where they go. So I'm going to kind of move quickly here because I'm a little long on time. I'm going to pass that. We did ban DDT. It was one of a whole host of other types of persistent organic pollutants that were banned. The only way that DDT has been approved to use is for malarial mosquitoes, simply because it's extremely cheap and effective. So that's the only way that DDT can be used. But here's a whole host of other pollutants, pesticides that we banned back in 2001, because again, we knew these things caused problems. So how do we know how much, what dose is dangerous? So we use something called toxicity measures, and we look at the dose and the response. So the dose is how much is entering a living thing, and the response is the type of damage that happens to that dose. And we have something called the lethal dose or the sublethal dose. So the lethal dose is typically expressed in milligrams of the toxicant per kilogram of body weight. And we call it the LD50. So the LD50 is the amount in a lab that would kill 50% of test animals. The smaller this number is, it means the more toxic the chemical happens to be. So for example, these are the LD50 values for a whole host of chemicals, right? The idea here is the bigger this number is, the safer it is. So the good news is that aspirin is really, really safe. Can you OD on aspirin? Sure, of course you can, but it would take an awful lot of aspirin to OD on. As you move down the list, these things become increasingly more dangerous. Caffeine is more dangerous than morphine. Okay, so that's something to kind of think about here just a little bit. In high doses, caffeine is extremely dangerous. Again, as we move down the list, you see things, nicotine in particular is a very dangerous substance, and then something like strychnine would be particularly damaging. So we also have something called the effective dose, so the LD and the ED. The ED50 is something that causes 50% of the population to exhibit some type of a response. It could be hair loss, it could be nausea, it could be reduced enzyme activity, it could be a pregnant fetus is impacted. So this is sort of what we use to figure out what the threshold level of a toxicant is. This is when we're looking at what dose can you be exposed to and have absolutely no impact. So what you would do is you do what's called a dose response curve. So again, you're looking at sort of how many people in the population are exhibiting a response to whatever the toxicant is we're looking at. The 50% mark here is again called the ED50, the effective dose, but what we want to know is the threshold level. So where is it that we can be exposed and still not have an impact? Keep in mind there are some toxicants that have no threshold level, that we can't be exposed to any amount of it before we actually begin to see impacts. So carcinogens are specifically cancer-causing substances. I'm going to kind of pass through this a little bit quickly. We test carcinogens in much the same way that we test other types of chemicals. Keep in mind that when it comes to susceptible populations, specifically children, children are always more susceptible to toxicants than adults because they weigh less and they metabolize faster. So we know that there are a whole host of different substances that are more dangerous to children than there are to humans, which is why globally children tend to be in a higher category when it comes to deaths, when it's responsible for things like water pollutants and air pollutants and all these things we've talked about, because again, they metabolize things much faster and they weigh less, so smaller doses are more dangerous.